Hey guys, and welcome back to a brand new video. Today, we're gonna be diving into Lightroom Classic 2025, and I'll be walking you through absolutely everything that you need to know to be able to get started. Everything from the import all the way to the export, those little export settings at the end will be covered, and I'll be doing it all inside of a brand new Lightroom catalog, so it looks like I've just opened up Lightroom Classic for the very first time, like I know a lot of you might be doing. So without further ado, let's dive into Lightroom and let's get this video started. All right, so here we are inside of Lightroom Classic, and as you can see, I've got absolutely nothing in here. I've got no presets, I've got no photos, absolutely nothing. Now, just quickly, before we do jump in, I wanna let you know that I've got this little yellow kind of spot over my mouse, and that comes up every single time that I click. Hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for you to follow along. All right, so let's first kick things off with importing our photos into Lightroom. Now, there are two main ways you can do this. You can hit the import button down here, right here, or you can just drag and drop images onto Lightroom when you're inside of the library tab. As you can see in the top right-hand corner, we are in the library tab, not the develop, map, book, slideshow, print, or web. We are over here in the library tab. Now, if you are in the develop tab and you just try and drag and drop images in, nothing will happen. You won't be able to import. You can only import when you're in the library tab. So if we come down here, I'm gonna open up my Finder. I've got 3 photos here that are gonna allow me to show you every single tool inside of Lightroom Classic so you can get a really good idea of how everything works. And all I'm gonna do is I'm going to click and drag over the photos and then drag and drop them into the library tab right here. And then the import window is going to pop up. So as you can see, I've got 1, 2, 3 photos ticked. And if we just double click on the images, I can arrow through and we can go through the shots here. Now, if I didn't want one of these photos, I can just hit the little include in import button, and that either clicks the box or unclicks the box, which is great. And then if I wanna go back to that view of all of the grid photos, I can just click this little button down here and then I'm good to go. But since I've already gone through and sort of selected these images, I'm going to go ahead and click import in the bottom right-hand corner, and now Lightroom will begin the import process. Thankfully, we're only importing 3 photos, so that's pretty much instant. And now you've got some photos in Lightroom. However, we're not done just yet. One of the things I love doing in Lightroom is selecting my images and going through and finding the ones I do and don't want to keep. Now, I've already done that somewhat so inside of Finder, so I don't particularly need to do that, but I want to walk you through that workflow because it is super, super handy. So all we're going to do here is double click on our first photo, and then just like the import window, I can arrow through these images. Now I can hit from numbers 1 all the way through to 5. So I can do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And as you can see there, we have got the stars popping up, and you can also see set rating to 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So I can also hit 0 and that will clear the rating. And what I usually do is I go through all my photos and I say, okay, I like this photo, it's a 1. Oh, I definitely like this photo, it's a 5. And then maybe I don't like this photo at all, I'll leave it at 0. Then what I would do from here is I would come over to the filter little section, little drop down menu right here. I would click on the little arrows here and then I would click rated. Now instantly that removes the photo that we didn't rate, the last photo that we had, but I want to dial things in a little bit more. Maybe I only want to see my 1-star photos, or maybe I only want to see my 5-star photos. And I can do that by clicking this little greater than logo, and then I can hit equal to 1 star, or equal to 5 star. And that way I can easily kind of navigate the photos that I do and that I don't want to edit. With me only importing 3 photos into Lightroom, it might not be the best example ever. However, if you're importing hundreds and hundreds of photos and you need to go through and do your selection process inside of Lightroom, I promise you the little workflow that I just showed you there is gonna save your life. But for the purpose of this video, let's go back to this less than 5 stars, and we are now good to go. Equal to or less than 5 stars. And that way we have no filter selected and we can see all of our photos. Okay, so that's pretty much us wrapped up in the library tab. Let's head over to the develop tab. All right, so to get into our develop tab, we wanna come over to the top right-hand corner, click on the develop tab, and now we are here. And this is where all of the changes to our photo are going to happen. Now, chances are if you're opening up Lightroom for the first time, you are gonna have all of your settings looking a little something like this. And what you want to do is go ahead and open up all of these drop-down menus. Well, of course, it's going to give me a few little tool breakdowns, if you will, but just close them for now. I promise I'll cover absolutely everything. So just open up all of the tools here, and now your Develop tab should be looking a little something like this. Now there is a lot going on this screen, but like I said, don't worry, I'm about to walk you through absolutely everything. So the first thing I want to do is get you familiar with the Develop tab. If we come over to the left-hand side here, we've got something called the Navigator. If this is closed, make sure it is open. We've then got the spot for our presets, snapshots, history, and collections. Now, the preset tab is pretty standard. This is where you can go ahead and import or create your own editing presets, which will save certain settings in your Develop tab that you've decided to save, and then you can go ahead and easily kind of implement those onto your photos. So that is something that we're gonna walk through in just a moment. You've got snapshots here, which is when you get to a pretty good spot of where you're happy with your image, if you will, and then you can kind of create a snapshot of the edit. I absolutely never use this. We've got history, which is completely empty right now, but if I were to adjust the exposure, you can see the history sort of comes up there. And this is a really good way for you to be able to keep track of your edits. If we just add a few more little adjustments to the slider, you can see that when I hover over each individual change, you can see that the image actually reverts back to what it was. So for example, if I clicked on import, it's going to take me back to and reset all of the sliders as to when it was during my import process, which is absolutely no changes involved whatsoever. So let's close that up. And then we've got our collections tab here. If you want to import a load of photos into Lightroom and then sort of subcategorize them, you can do so in the collections tab. All you've got to do here is hit the little plus, create collection. You can name it. So Lightroom, Lightroom, nice. Let's just call it Lightroom for now. Include selected photos means you're just including the photos that you have selected down here. So obviously I have the first photo selected here. I could hit create, and now I can easily just go back and reference any sort of like I said, subcategory of images that you want to create. If you want to go back to seeing all of your images, just come down to the little drop-down menu right here, hit all photographs, and then you'll be seeing all the photos you've imported. So that kind of gives us a little rough breakdown over here. Let's move over to the right-hand side. First up on the list, we've got the histogram, which gives us a complete breakdown in a different way of what our image looks like. So if we hover over the histogram, you can see that we actually get a little reading, if you will. So we've got the blacks here, we've got our shadows here, we've got our exposure or our midtones here, and that'll make sense in just a moment. We've got our highlights here and our whites here. And what this is doing is letting me know where the image is sitting. So for example, we have quite a lot of information on the left-hand side and pretty much absolutely nothing on the right-hand side. And if I hover over the different areas of the histogram, you can see here that we have the blacks and we have the shadows, which means this image is actually darker than it is brighter. However, if I were to just increase the exposure, you can see the histogram moves quite dramatically. Now, obviously the image looks absolutely terrible here, but this is just a little bit of an insight to how the histogram works and moves. So if you wanted a little bit more of a balanced image rather than just having a dark image, maybe increasing the exposure like you're seeing now kind of drags out our histogram quite a lot, but now there's a little bit too much bright information, too much bright value on our histogram. So we'd come in here and then drop the highlights. And as you can see, that sort of backs it off. I'm just gonna double click on each of these sliders here, and you can do that in every single one of the Develop tabs sliders. So in the basic, in the tone curve, the color mixer, you name it. And what that will do is reset the slider. So let's say you just push something way too far, just double click on it and it will reset it to 0. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, there are 4 other things actually that I wanna run you through. We've got the crop tool right here. We've got the eraser/remove tool here. We have got the red eye removal tool here, and then we have the masking tool here. I'm gonna dive into each one of those individually as we progress in the video, but the first one I want to unpack is the crop tool. So to enter the crop tool, we've just got to hit the little crop button or hit R, and now we are greeted with this. Now, chances are your crop overlay doesn't look exactly like mine. Apparently, when you create a new catalog inside of Lightroom, Lightroom keeps a whole lot of the customizations and changes you had inside of your other catalogs. However, if you want to cycle through a handful of crop overlays, you can do so just by pressing O. Now, this can help you out in a number of ways to find the exact perfect composition, but for me, 99.99% of the time I'm using this one. This is like a weird cross-section one, but I find that it makes it really easy to find the midpoint of my image, as I just have to reference this point, this point, this point, and this point, and anything within that sort of diamond-shaped box, is in the middle. So I'm quite happy with that. So when you want to crop your image, all you've got to do is come to any of the corners or the midpoints of any of the sides, and you can kind of drag things around. All you're doing is clicking and holding. If you want less at the top, we can come in like that. Cool, looking good. If you want to make an adjustment so everything stays where it is, which will make sense in just a moment, all you've got to do is hold Option on Mac, Alt on Windows, click and hold one of the little points where you can adjust the crop. And while you hold Alt, the entire sort of crop box moves in sync, if you will. You're not just pulling in from either one of the corners. Now, let's say you wanted to take this image but turn it vertically. All you've got to do is hit X, and that will rotate your crop. So as you can see, we go from landscape to vertical, and so on and so forth. I'm just hitting X quite a few times there. And then if you want to change your crop ratio, all you've got to do is come over to the aspect tool here. Make sure you have this locked. If you don't have it locked, or you can, for example, you can go crazy with the crop tool. So I'd make sure to always keep it locked. As you can see, the little lock logo there is locked. But if you want to change the crop ratio, you just want to come to original, the little drop down menu right here, and then you can choose from your crop ratios here, or you can enter a custom one. So for example, I love the 2.35 by 1. I believe it's that crop ratio. It is. I love it horizontally, just like that. And this is one of my favorite crop ratios that I suggest you add to your what would you call that? Arsenal of crop ratios. And then you can see there, you just kind of have that as a custom one right there. But the crop ratio for Instagram, which I know a lot of you will be using your images for, is 4:5. However, it's 4:5 in the vertical crop ratio. So just like that, we can crop our photo to vertical and we are good to go. Now, one last thing I want to show you when it comes to cropping, but let's move on to a different image here, is straightening your image. Because a lot of the time, especially beginner photographers, will take their image a little bit crooked. Even me right here, this isn't 100% straight. Like, it's not off completely, but it's not exactly straight either. So let's just adjust the angle of this. And there's a few ways you can do it. What you can do is you can come over to the angle tool right here and just slide this back and forward. And you can, of course, double click, it'll reset to 0. Or you can come outside of the little crop, your image section here, I should say. And when you're in this gray area, all of a sudden you can click and hold and drag and rotate. But let's undo that. So for example, let's make this image completely crooked. Let's open up our crop tool once again. And I'm gonna make my way to this tiny little ruler here. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna allow me to find a point in my image where it's straight, draw a little line, and then it will crop to make sure that that part of the image is straight. So I'm looking right here. One of the easiest straight lines I can find is this little, I don't even know what you'd call it, part of the wall right here. So I'm just gonna make sure that my line, I'm clicking, holding and dragging, and then my white line will appear, and I want to make sure my white line is straight. I'm going to click and let go, and it has not done a great job there. Let's do this on a different line instead. Then we're going to come over here, do this line, boom, there we go. I'm going to hit enter, and now my image is cropped. It really hasn't adjusted many things, if any. This was a really weird street, maybe not the best example to show you how to straighten images, but I find that the best place to use this ruler on, if you can't kind of adjust it with your eyes, is the horizon. If you're taking photos where you can clearly see the horizon, simply open up the crop tool, open up the little ruler here, draw across the horizon, and you'll be good to go. And that'll make sure your images are completely straight. All right, so with the crop tool out of the way, hopefully you've got a very strong idea of how to use the crop tool. Let's move on to actually editing our photos. I want to quickly mention that we are still in the Develop tab, and we'll pretty much be in the Develop tab for the rest of the video. But the next thing I want to cover is presets. Now, presets can be super hit or miss, and especially when you're just starting to get into photo editing, getting it right with presets can be hard. So I want to show you my entire preset editing workflow. So hopefully, if you've bought any presets in the past, you can start using them like a pro. What we want to do is make our way over to the preset tab here, press the little plus logo, and then hit import presets. This is assuming, however, that you have already purchased some presets, or you have some presets from friends that you've already gotten in the past and that you would like to use them. But if you don't have any presets, but you would like to sort of understand and get into an interesting workflow, speed up your editing workflow, and also work out how some professional photographers edit their images, you can go down to the first link in the description and check out my master collection of Lightroom presets, my Lightroom presets for iPhone, and my Filmic Feels Lightroom presets. Whatever presets kind of look like they will fit the vibe of your photos, go ahead and pick them up down below. You can use this discount code at checkout, and then you'll be left with a folder just like this one right here. Now, this is my Filmic Feels presets, and as you can see here, we've got film 1 through 7, we've got film portrait 1 through 5, and what I want to do is take these presets and import them into Lightroom. So as I did before, I'm going to click the little plus here, import presets. You then want to navigate to where your presets are, probably in your download tab. You then want to unzip the pack if you've downloaded them from me, make your way over to the WhatsApp desktop files, and then you'll be left with something that looks like this. You'll be left with XMP files. Now, what you can do here is you can just click on one of these. You can shift click to the bottom. You can click all 5 or all, what's that, 5 plus. You can click all 11, or you can drag and kind of like select all your presets like this, or you can just go through and hit Command on Mac or Control on Windows, hold that down and then click individual ones. Personally, I'd always recommend just to import all the presets, and then from there you can sort of work out what ones do and don't work for you. So let's come to film 1, hit import. It's gonna come up with a little error message because I already have all of my presets imported. I don't know why, but as soon as I clicked over to the develop tab, all of my presets from my past Lightroom catalogs were there. So here we are. I've got the Filmic Feels, all of my master collection stuff, my iPhone stuff, and then also the colorways and a handful of other preset packs that you might know about later. But anyway, for now, let's just dive into, for example, the Filmic Feels presets. And what you want to do here is just scroll through and just hover over each individual preset. There's no way to be able to look at a preset like Film 4, for example, and go, oh, that will work on this shot, that will work on this shot. Unless you've got an extensive knowledge of how the presets work and you've sort of memorized the exact settings that are in that preset, my personal experience and my personal recommendation, if you will, is just go through and scroll over all of these presets and you get a pretty good idea of what ones do and don't work. These are the portrait ones, maybe not super ideal for this image. Let's go back up to, I don't know, film 1 looks pretty good. Film 2 looks great. They all look pretty good. Let's go film 1. We will just click on that and now the preset has been applied. Now, if you've bought someone else's presets, not mine, chances are they've either changed the white balance, the tone, the exposure, the contrast, the shadows, the whites, the highlights, and or they've added and left masks in from their image. It's a bit of a red flag because there's no way that anyone making presets can sort of predict whether your image was shot under or overexposed, whether you shot with the right white balance, what lighting conditions you shot in, and if your image needs certain masks. Masks are very, very specific to the image that you're editing. So if you do have any presets that you bought from someone else that have all of these changes already on the preset themselves, go ahead and reset them all, but just by double clicking all of the sliders, and then you should be good to go from there. But if we scroll down here, you can see that we've got all of the changes down here. Now, I don't want to spoil anything too much because I want to make sure that we can walk through all of the settings in just a moment. But the last thing I want to show you is the preset intensity slider. So if we come over here, and this should just be above your preset tab, you can drag this slider to the left and to the right. Obviously, to the right is increasing the amount of the preset that is added to your shot. To the left, we'll do the exact opposite. But the cool thing here is if we wanted to increase this, let's just do it to 200. I know that this image doesn't look all that great at 200. You can see now that all of the settings have been changed, but they've been changed according to how much we've increased the intensity of the preset. And we can see this happening live. So if we start to dial this back down and I let go, you can see the tone curve just changed. If we come back up here, keep your eye on clarity, dehaze, and vibrance. If we increase that again, you can see all the settings change again. I'm gonna double click that and that will reset this back to 0. But as you can see there, this gives you a really good idea of what settings are being changed and what you need to change to increase the intensity of certain presets or certain settings. But that pretty much wraps up my Lightroom preset workflow. We can sort of match this up with what I'm about to show you because we are about to dive into the basic tab and I'm gonna walk you through exactly how you can start to edit your photos from scratch and how you can start to understand all of the tools inside of Lightroom Classic. All right, so let's first start out with our white balance slider up here. This one is pretty straightforward. If you want your image to look a little bit more blue or a little bit more warm, you simply just slide the slider accordingly, and same with the tint. However, if you're not shooting with auto white balance, chances are your images are going to be coming out looking all kind of crazy colors when you're moving from different lighting condition to different lighting condition. So how can we make this process a whole lot easier? Well, there are a few ways. You can open up this little drop down menu right here and hit auto. This gives you a pretty good good idea of what your image should be looking like, but we're gonna hit Command on Mac, Control on Windows, Z, and this is gonna undo what we just did there. But there is another way we can correct our white balance, which I find gives you a little bit more control, and I find also gives you a little bit better of a result as well. It's this little white balance dropper right here. So all you wanna do is we're on a computer. Want to click on this little white balance dropper. That's going to sort of turn our cursor into the white balance dropper. And then what you want to do is find a part of your image that should be pure white or pure gray. So if we come to the white painted image here, the white painted part of this tram here, and I click on it, you can see that the white balance gets adjusted. And now this image is probably a little bit too cool, but right here is looking pretty accurate versus when it looked very warm before. Now, if we pick this dropper up once again, you can see up in the navigator section, as I move around certain parts of the image, the white balance changes accordingly. And this is a really good thing to keep an eye on, because that way you can sort of get a little bit of a preview before you lock the white balance in. So if we come to maybe a spot right here, I would say looking at the navigator, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to click on that, and then it's just going to adjust it slightly. And this way we are getting accurate colors in our shot. And that's the entire sort of reason behind white balance, is to make sure you're getting accurate colors in your image and things look true to life. So with the white balance section out of the way, let's move into our tone section. This one is pretty straightforward. You want to increase the exposure or decrease the exposure, move the exposure slider accordingly. It's just going to brighten or darken your shot. I wouldn't suggest doing this all that often. Obviously, you want to be nailing your exposure, but I find myself usually shooting underexposed. As you can see, if we have a look at the histogram here, we've got so much detail and information on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side. So what I find myself doing usually is just increasing the exposure just a little bit when I shoot underexposed, and then I make all of the other changes to the image's exposure, I should say, with the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So for now, I'm just gonna leave this exposure set to plus 0.5, and keep in mind, you can just double click and reset that slider if need be. Let's get that to where we had it. Now, moving on to contrast. If you increase the contrast slider, you are going to be making the darker parts of your image darker and the brighter parts of your image brighter. Let's have a look at what that looks like. Just like that, you can see the darker parts of our image are now more or less black, and the bright parts of our image have gotten a lot whiter. If I double click on that, you can now see that we've got a lot more detail here, and we now also, probably a little bit too zoomed in there, we now also have a lot of detail here as well. Now, the opposite will happen if I decrease the contrast slider. Things get very flat, the shadows have been raised, and the highlights have been lowered. And you can see here, the histogram, you can see, if I double click there, all of those shadows kind of get pushed up, and there's not too much going on in the highlight section because we don't have many of them. So what I usually do is I leave my contrast slider as is. I don't particularly like playing around with this. I much prefer adding contrast in the tone curve, which is what we'll get to in just a moment. Now, moving into the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, this is where I find things get fun. At least things start to get quite fun. The highlights are going to control the bright parts of your image. So as you can see, just moving that slider violently, we can see things get really dark, things get really bright. So for this image specifically here, I would look at decreasing the highlights just a touch, and that is because we have quite bright lights and quite bright windows. And then moving on to the shadows, you already know if we increase them, the shadows get brighter, decrease them, they get darker. We're just going to increase the shadows just a little bit here because we have so much detail in our shadows and our darker parts of our image. And then moving on to the whites and blacks. This is going to change the white point of your image and the black point of your image. So if we decrease this, you can see things get out of hand very quickly. Now, if you go ahead and press J on your keyboard, you're gonna see these weird color overlays start to pop up. And if you see any of these color overlays start to pop up, it means you actually don't have any information apart from pure white or pure black in those spots. Red is going to be pure white, and I believe blue is going to be pure black, just like that. Decreasing the black is going to make that blue color overlay start to pop up. So you can see we have got a little bit in the bottom corner here, but this is not an issue. So I'm gonna leave the black slider as is for now, but if we have a look at our white slider, we can check out and see what exactly is clipping. The light bulbs in here, by the way, you can press J to turn this off again. Just J, 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 J. Let's leave that off for now. You can see that the parts that are clipping are the light bulbs, and that's actually not a bad thing. If we go ahead and decrease the whites, you can see things just get a little bit flatter. So I would, by the way, never suggest to just completely max out or decrease a slider to minus or positive 100. So as you can see there, we have done that on the white. But if we just decrease this a little bit, it's gonna help us out when we're editing later and pushing and pulling things in the tone curve, and we're adding different colors in certain parts of our image. So for now, I'm gonna leave that as is at minus 31. Now moving into the presets here, we've got texture, clarity, and dehaze. I know as someone just getting into Lightroom, you might be looking at texture, clarity, and dehaze and going, whoa, add more texture, add more clarity, dehaze my image, max those sliders out. Well, unfortunately, that isn't always the best use case for these sliders and can actually make your images look incredibly cheap and nasty, I'm sorry to say. So what do these sliders do? Well, the texture slider will increase sharpness in the mid-tone areas of our shot. So no bright areas and no dark areas will be affected. No super bright or super dark areas will be affected. And we can see this by, let's say, zooming in here where we've got a little bit of a mid-tone part of our image here. And what that means is just not super bright and just not super dark, but then we've got this light bulb right here, which is definitely very bright. So if we increase the texture here, you can see that nothing really happens to that light bulb whatsoever, even this light bulb all the way down in the back there. And it just either increases the texture and makes things a little bit sharper around those mid-tone areas, or just doesn't affect them if they're too bright or too dark. Personally, for me, I usually leave my texture slider as is. And then when it comes to clarity, clarity affects the entire image. Whether it's bright or dark, a mid-tone, whatever the case, it just affects absolutely everything. Now for me, what I usually do here is I actually decrease the clarity. I find that images these days are incredibly sharp, and that's a very good thing, but sometimes they can be a little bit too sharp. And I like taking that really over sharpened edge off highlights specifically. And I find when decreasing my clarity to between -10 and -20, I get that look. Now moving on to dehaze, this is a little bit of a different tool. This is best used when you've got haze in your image, whether that's light fog or low cloud or whatever the case. I don't know how Lightroom does it. I don't know what settings are changed to make these kind of adjustments, but increasing the dehaze removes that haze from your shot. Now, as you can see here, we don't have too much haze in our image, really apart from this back window, which seems to be perfectly in focus. So you can see when I reset the dehaze slider, things are a little bit hazy. They're not as contrasty or punchy, but if I increase that, you can see outside pretty much becomes perfectly normal and what you would assume an image would look like. It kind of brings things back to life. But if we zoom out here, things have now gotten way too dark and they are way too over contrasty and saturated. So we're gonna reset this slider back to 0 and maybe just increase the dehaze a touch. Not too much, just a little bit. Now moving on to vibrance and saturation. These two are very, very interesting, and I usually leave these at 0 because I do all of my color stuff later down in our settings in the color mixer tab. But there is a difference between vibrance and saturation. And the difference is very similar to texture and clarity. Vibrance, for example, will try and either bring out if you increase it or will reduce if you decrease it, colors that aren't super represented in your image. So for example here, my guess is that if we increase the vibrance slider, the yellows will be affected just a little bit, but nowhere near as much as the oranges in the seats, for example, and maybe this like weird blueness outside. So let's increase this, as you can see, turning that on and off. Yes, things are getting affected in our yellows, but they're not getting affected as much. Like this yellow is nowhere near as affected as the yellow in the roof because this is clearly far more desaturated than this area down here. However, when we increase or decrease the saturation, everything gets increased equally. So it just brings up all the colors or decreases all the colors. Once again, I leave these as is 9 times out of 10, but it's super important to understand the difference between vibrance and saturation because they are two completely different sliders, but they just sit right next to each other and look incredibly similar. All right, so with the basic panel out of the way, let's move into the tone curve. I find that I make so many adjustments in the tone curve and you can do so much in the tone curve. It's a very, very powerful tool. So your tone curve, chances are, looks a little bit like this. And this is sort of like the basic tone curve to get a a bit more of an idea when you have absolutely no idea what this tool does. But we are gonna put this to the side for a moment, and we are gonna be making sure we're using the second one right here. And this is where you get the most customization. Now, just quickly, we do have 3 other tone curves. We've got red, green, and blue. I do not use this inside of my editing workflow, at least not right now. But what you can do here is you can add points by clicking on the tone curve, and then you can push and pull different colors into different parts of your image. I much prefer to do this in the color grading tab, just a few sections away. But just to give you a quick idea of exactly what this does, for example, if we wanted to push more red into the shadows, and I'll break down things in just a moment, but if we wanted to push more red into our shadows, we would increase it down here. And if we wanted to push more blue into the shadows, we could decrease it and pull it down and away. I'm just gonna double click on all of those dots and then make our way back to our point curve here. And this is going to be affecting our shadows, our midtones, our highlights, our whites, our blacks, you name it. Now, the reason I like the tone curve so much is because you can control the midtones of your image. If we scroll back up here to the basic tab, you can see that there's no midtone slider whatsoever, but down here, we can control them. I know I've mentioned midtones a lot, but I find that they're such an important part of your image that they definitely should not be forgotten about, if you will. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna add 3 new points onto the tone curve. We're gonna click right here on this cross section, on this cross section, and on this cross section. Now do keep in mind that you will need to use a slightly different tone curve for each image that you edit, because this does affect the overall exposure, but you can get a rough idea of how you like your photos to look. And once you have your tone curve kind of set in place, the one that you've been using quite a lot, all you've got to do is do slight adjustments to it, and you should be able to replicate a similar look onto every single photo using a similar tone curve. Now, these 3 points that we've just added here now mean we have 5 points. Now, these 5 points represent a different part of our image. The one in the far bottom left-hand corner is the blacks. The next one up is the shadows. We've then got the mid-tone point right here. The highlights are controlled from this point, and then the whites are controlled from this point. So let's have a quick play around. But please keep in mind that any major adjustments here are gonna turn your image crazy. For example, if I just grab the shadow point right here and move it like this, far from ideal. So let's Command Z that on Mac, Control on Windows, and let's just start to make things a little bit nicer. What I find myself doing is following the S curve. I like to add a slight little curve that represents a very slight S to my shot. And what this does is add contrast, and it also kind of helps the midtones and highlights pop a little bit as well. So what we're gonna do is grab our shadow point here and move it down just a little bit. We're gonna come to the midtones here. We're gonna center that and then move it up a touch. And then we are gonna do the same thing with the highlights here. Now, as you can see, we've got a slight little S curve. Sometimes you're gonna need more than others. If we make our way over to this image here, we can click here, here, and here. Doesn't matter if things move while you're clicking. We can drop the shadows, increase the midtones, and then we can also increase the highlights there. Now you can see a before and after of any one tool simply by clicking and holding this eye. So we went from this. If I release it, it'll show us after, to this, before and after, and we can do the same thing right here as well. I would say this image here might be a little bit better of an example to use the tone curve on. So as you can see, we've now got a little bit of an S, but we haven't controlled the black or the white point just yet. And I'm about to show you what I do to these points individually. Let's start up here with the white point. So what we're gonna do is just drag this down ever so slightly, and it's just gonna take that harshness off our highlights just a little bit. Now moving on to our black point here, I like to do the exact opposite by fading out the blacks by lifting the point up. Now what this is gonna do is just add a little bit of a nicer fade over the entire shot. And by the way, please keep in mind that this is all up to personal preference. You could add 1,000 more points all over this dot, all over this line, and change it as you wish. But for me, this is just how I like to use the tone curve. Go ahead and play around with it as much as possible so you can really start to dial in and develop your own personal style. Back to that black dot though, let's just lift this up a little bit. As you can see, if we go like crazy, things get way too faded out, but we're just gonna lift this up just a little bit like that. Now let's have a look at a before and after just on the tone curve, before and after, I would say things are looking far, far nicer. It's a little less contrasty. I find that the carriages stand out a little bit more from the shot, and that subtle fade in the black, dark area of our shot just makes this image look super nice. So I know we've done none of the other changes to this image, so what we're gonna do is make our way over to this image once again. Something I've just noticed is the crop wasn't exactly nailed, so I'm just gonna quickly crop this image. We're gonna crop it for 4:5, just like that. This looks much nicer. So let's do the same changes we just did to the last image on this image here. We're gonna increase the black value and we're gonna decrease the white value, just like that. Now, if we wanna see a complete before and after of this image of all of the changes that we've made, what you've got to do is hit backslash. So this is where we started. This is where we're at right now. A lot warmer before, nice, cooler now. The exposure overall just looks a little bit nicer as well. So you can just kind of do this a few times to understand exactly how far you've progressed. Maybe you've pushed or pulled something a little bit too far, but the before and after tool is very, very powerful. So with the tone curve all wrapped up, let's move on to the color mixer tab. Now, there are two sort of sections of the color mixer tab. We've got the mixer part and the point color part. Both are incredibly similar, but they do very, very different things. So if we have a look at our mixer tab here, you can see your Lightroom might be looking a little different right now. By the way, you might just have hue, saturation, or luminance ticked. I like to always make sure I have all ticked. And that means I can see my hue, my saturation, and luminance sliders. But if we come over to point color here, you can see that we need to use the point color dropper to add a sample. So let's say, for example, we wanted to click right here. So all I've done is pick that dropper up and then I've clicked right here. And now you can see we've got hue, saturation, and luminance. So you can see the big brown bar right here is the color that we've sampled. And then as we change the sliders down below, you can actually visualize the changes happening. Now this is really handy, especially if you're just getting started with Lightroom. And I would assume you are if you've watched this far into the video. But the whole point between point color and color mixer is to give you the flexibility if just in case color mixer doesn't have the exact color you want to be editing. So for example, let's have a look at point color right here. We're looking for brown. Well, in the color mixer tab, we've got red, orange, yellow, green, aqua blue, purple, magenta. There's no brown. So if I really wanted to just select those seats and make the same adjustments I can to red, orange, so on and so forth, then I can do so inside of the point color tool. I don't find myself using the point color tool all that often. However, when I do need it and when you need it, it is extremely handy. So let's, for the sake of this video, move our way back over to the mixer tab. And now I'm gonna walk you through hue, saturation, and luminance because they are all completely different. The hue slider changes the value of the color. So for example, let's have a look at yellow since we've got a lot of yellow in this shot. If I move the yellow over to the left, it makes things a lot more orange. However, if I wanted to make the yellows in my image a lot more green, I could do so by moving that slider all the way over to the green side. And you can do this for all the colors listed here. Same with the orange. If we wanted to make them more red, we could. If we wanted to make them more green, we could do so as well. And the same goes for the blues. The same goes for all of the colors that you see here. That is the point of the hue sliders. Now moving into the saturation sliders, this is where you can get to control the intensity of a certain color. And if you remember from before, this is why I leave the vibrance and saturation sliders as is, because now I get to come in here and control each individual color as I would like. So for example, we've got a lot of orange in this shot, maybe backing it off just a little bit might be a good idea. And if we backed it all off, it more or less turns into gray. And if we increase it like crazy, as you can see, the intensity of that color really ramps up. So let's double click that slider and reset it to 0. And then moving on to luminance, this is how bright or how dark a color is. For example, orange is a great example for this image, right? Let's grab orange, move it all the way down to the left. You can see the oranges in this image get darker. And then if we do the opposite, the oranges in this image get brighter. So what I'm gonna do is walk you through a quick little workflow of how I would use the hue, saturation, and luminance tab, also known as the color mixer tab. And you'll get a little bit of an idea of what I'm looking for and what changes I'm making to the shot. So let's kick things off with the hue tab. I don't really see much red in this image apart from this chain here, so I'm gonna leave it as is for now. The orange tone, I really like it, so I'm gonna leave it as is. The yellows might move over to the oranges just slightly. I don't see much green, but just for good housekeeping, I'm going to move the green over to a warmer side, just in case there are a handful of greens sort of floating around. The blues, the aquas and the blues, I'm going to move the aquas over towards the blue side a little bit more, and then the blues over to the aqua side a little bit more. This just helps with that orange and teal vibe a little bit. And then purple and magenta, I don't see any purple or magenta in this image, so we're going to move on. Into the saturation sliders now, I'm going to desaturate the reds just to make this little chain here a little less distracting, if you will, and the X on this little ticket machine a little less distracting. The oranges, I'm going to decrease these a touch as well, and I'm going to do the same with the yellows. I much prefer a more muted look on this shot, as the lights in this image make things very intense. Now we're going to come into the greens, the aquas, and the blues. We're going to dial off all of these colors. Even though they're represented extremely little in this shot, it's just good housekeeping to make sure that when you export your image, you don't have these weird color casts, or you don't just have like a weird line of purple that you didn't see in your image. Now, when it comes to luminance, I'm not going to make many changes here. Maybe, if any, we're going to just drop the yellow luminance a little bit, which kind of helps those lights not be as bright. We're just decreasing them ever so slightly. And now if we come back up here to our color mixer, we can turn this off and back on. And just like that, we've sort of reduced the intensity of the colors in the image and made things look a little bit more true to life, at least in my opinion. So with the color mixer tab out of the way, let's now move into color grading. This is a very powerful tool. Once again, I feel like I'm saying that for all of the tools, but they are all incredibly powerful. And the whole idea with the color grading tab is you can push and pull different colors into different parts of your image. So as you can see here, we've got our midtones, shadows, highlights, and then we can also click into each individual circle here. So shadows, midtones, highlights, and then we can also adjust our global overarching color and tone on our shot as well. But for now, we're going to come back to the midtone. We're going to come back to, sorry, the little triangle of colors here. And then we're going to have a look at pushing and pulling different colors into different parts of our image. So what would things look like if we push a little bit of blue into the shadows, a little bit of warmth into the midtones, and also a little bit of warmth into the highlights? As you can see, I think things are looking a little bit too intense. So what we can do here is we can, first of all, turn this off and on. I do like how things are looking, but it is a little intense. Now what I would do is come into each individual circle right here and just back off certain parts. Usually it's the saturation. I find adjusting the saturation, which would be this slider right here, is a little bit awkward to play with. And then of course, if you want to adjust the hue of the color that you're putting into the certain part of the image, you just want to click and drag this little circle around. I'm going to undo that, come back to the shadows here. It's a lot bigger to play with, so it's much easier to adjust there. But I'm just going to dial back the blue hue that we're adding into the shadows, making our way over to the midtones. Let's dial this back just a touch, and the same thing with the highlights ever so slightly. Now before and after, things just look a little bit nicer in my opinion. I think adding more warm tones into the highlights and the midtones was a good shout here, but cooling the shadows off just a little bit sort of adds a little bit more balance into our shot as well. Now you can play around with this until your heart is content. Some images require more, some require less, some require none at all. But playing around with color grading is definitely going to be able to increase the overall look, feel, and vibe of your shot, and is a great way that you can implement your own personal style into your images. But with the color grading out of the way, we are about to zoom through the detail, lens correction, transform, lens blur, effects, and calibration sliders. And then we're going to make our way into some more enjoyable tools as well, because I don't find these ones all that fun to play around with. However, let's first talk about sharpening. Sharpening, if you haven't got the idea by now, I like to decrease the texture and clarity in my images. So I'm going to remove all the sharpening from my shot. But if you want to be adding sharpening to your shot, there are 1,000 ways you can do it. But inside Lightroom is a great way you can do it. Let's make our way over to this shot right here. We're going to decrease the sharpening, and then we're going to look at how we can add sharpening back. Because if we just increase sharpening like crazy, the entire image wants to be sharp. Even all the out of focus areas right here, you can see we've got like this weird texture going on. But if I decrease that, things look a lot more natural. So what if you only wanted to sharpen, for example, the phone that's in focus? Well, we're about to do that. We first want to increase our sharpening amount just a little bit, and that's so our masking little slider appears. Now what you want to do is you want to hit and hold Option on Mac, Alt on Windows, and then we want to just start playing around with this. Now, as you can see, when it's on 0, the entire image is white, and when I increase this, a lot of it goes black. And what that is doing is it's showing us that when things are white, it is being sharpened, but as I'm increasing this, black is not being sharpened. So if I just wanted to increase the phone, I'd look at really dialing in the masking quite a lot. And now if we increase the sharpening like crazy and zoom in again, you can see that there's no weird sort of artifacts in the background because we've increased the masking so much. But our phone, if we just turn this off and back on, you can see it's ever so slightly. It's really just the rim of this phone. If we turn it off and on, you can see our phone is now sharpened. But I'm not a huge fan of sharpening my images. Like I said, the photos and the photo quality, even coming from your phone these days, is usually more than sharp enough. And adding digital sharpening can kind of just make things look a little bit meh, in my opinion. So with the sharpening out of the way, let's now move into noise reduction. This is a huge tool that you can use and pretty much save a lot of photos as well. I don't have any photos here that were shot over 125 ISO, so for me, noise reduction isn't really necessary. If you want to just do slight noise adjustments, let's say you shot at maybe ISO 1000 or 2000, and you've got a little bit of noise in the shadows, simply just by increasing the luminance a touch here will more or less completely fix that and make things look a little bit nicer. But if you were shooting at like 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 ISO, what you want to do is hit denoise. Now this is going to be using AI to denoise your image. That's a mouthful. But the results from this is incredible. Right, let's have a look at our shot here. Like I said, this might not be the best example, but play around with this on your high ISO photos. If we decrease this, yeah, you really can't see much of a difference because this was shot at 100 ISO. But if you increase it like crazy and you hit enhance, the results you can get are incredible. Once again, I don't suggest maxing this slider out. So keeping it at, I would say between 20 and 50 is probably a good mix, but you'll know by your image, maybe you shot at 100,000 ISO and you're trying to bring it back to life, then definitely maybe denoise 100 might be the one for you. And once you hit enhance, Lightroom will then create a brand new DNG file, which is Adobe's raw photo file extension. I would suggest though, either doing this before you edit your photo or after you've completed all the edits on your image. That way you're not kind of getting into the middle of everything. You're hitting denoise and then some things are sort of changing. Maybe you need to go ahead and increase your clarity or texture because things just look a little soft, or maybe you need to go back and increase your sharpening. So one way or another, either do this before you've started editing or after you've started editing. So moving on from noise reduction, let's get into lens correction. If you're shooting with any of the big brands, Sony, Canon, Nikon, Fuji, Panasonic, whatever the case, and you're shooting with their native lenses, all you've got to do is hit enable profile corrections. And what this will do is take away some of the warping from your shot, because you can, if you're shooting with a really wide lens, things can kind of warp and look a little bit weird. If you've ever shot, for example, with the 0.5 times on your iPhone and you get it really close to your head, you'll know that, you know, things look kind of crazy. So that is what profile correction does. It also sort of removes a little bit of vignetting that can be caused by your lens as well. And then removing chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is where really bright and really dark areas meet. I don't particularly have a kind of like a, I guess an example on any of these photos, but where really bright and really dark areas contrast, sometimes, especially if you're using older lenses, you can get some sort of like purple, pink hues on those edges. So by just clicking remove chromatic aberration, I do this just for good measure, for good housekeeping. It will do a pretty good job at removing those colors if you have any of them in your shot. With that all out of the way though, let's say you hit enable profile corrections, and if you're shooting with a manual lens or just a really old camera setup and you don't see all your details kind of come up here. As you can see, I was shooting with the 20mm f1.8 G lens. What you've got to do is come in here and then go through all of the giant library that Adobe has. Go ahead, find the make of your lens, and then find the lens that you are actually shooting with, and then of course apply the profile if Adobe has it, and then the adjustments should be made accordingly. All right, so So with lens correction out of the way, let's now dive into the transform tab. There are a load of things you can do in this tab. You can squeeze your image, you can make it seem like it was shot on a little bit of a different angle, the absolute works. So what I would do is I would first suggest to just go in and sort of play around with some of these settings. Maybe this image was shot at a little bit of a back angle, so I might want to look at just decreasing the vertical sort of, I don't know, pitch, if you will. I don't know a better word for it. And it will sort of help tilt my photo just a touch like that. Maybe I've gone a little bit too far there, and now things are looking pretty good. Also with the horizontal, this will sort of like make your image sort of pan on an axis to make sure it looks like you shot straight down a, an alleyway or a road or whatever. You can really play around with things here. Now, if you don't want to do things manually, you can come in here and hit auto. I find that this doesn't work very well all of the time, but just dialing in small little adjustments can make your image look a lot nicer. However, of course, I would always recommend that you're nailing it in camera and not relying on your edit when you get home. But for example, I didn't nail it in camera here. So if we just sort of like adjust this a little bit, I would say things are looking good. And then what has happened here is because we've sort of adjusted and changed the image, we've got this white line here. Now you can hit constrain crop, but I don't particularly like doing this as it just kind of crops out that little white part. What I prefer doing is opening up the crop tool, holding Option on Mac, Alt on Windows, and then just dragging it up a little bit. And now if we have a look in the corner here, we've got no white lines whatsoever, and things are looking a little bit nicer. Now you can go through here and you can play around with all of these settings. For example, you can squash your image, you can make it a little bit taller, you can do all kind of crazy stuff. You can move the image around, you can, scale it in, scale it out. That's just zooming in and out. You can also do that in the crop function more or less. But yeah, go ahead and play around with the transform tool. The last thing I want to leave you with is this little tool right here. Now, if we click on this, what this is going to do is it is going to allow us to put different lines in different parts of our image to make sure things look absolutely perfect. Once again, I don't think that this image specifically is the best example for it, but hey, we're going to give it a go. So what I would do here is I would look for a box. Now, the best box I can find is this window back here. And now what I want to do is I want to click on the line and then drag it so it lines up on the other side. And then we're going to do this 4 times. So that's why you need a bit of a box. Come like that. Cool. And now we were wanting to do it on the vertical axis as well. And now if we have a look, maybe take your time a little bit more than me with that. However, if we have a look, if we just pop this back here, which is just clicking on this little circle, things look a little bit weird, like kind of the door frame surrounding everything. But this window is perfectly square now. But I am going to undo all of that just by hitting Command Z, Command Z. Okay, now things are looking pretty good. Wait, no, it's still on guided. If we have a look at history here, you can see perspective, scale, crop rectangle. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's close up our history tool there. But this works really well if you have like a nice frame surrounding a subject, but you took it on a little bit of a weird angle. Go ahead, get those guided lines out, and I promise you can thank me later for that one. Anyway, moving on from transform, let's open up our lens blur tab right here. Now, for this, you need a very clear subject. Even subjects like this, where we can very much so see that these are supposed to be in focus, these trams are what we're supposed to be looking at. This works best on a very clear subject like this, where you've got a lot of separation between the background and your subject, or vice versa. And what this will do is we're going to let Lightroom's AI analyze our image, find out exactly what the subject is, and then it will allow us to blur out the background of our shot. So in photography, a lot of people like that blurry background goodness. And I shot this at f1.8, as you can see right here. Now, usually lower f-stops are reserved for more expensive lenses, but the lower your f-stop is, the blurrier your background will be. So Lightroom has kind of saved the day here if you don't want to spend an absolute bucket load on lenses, and will allow you to blur out your subject pretty realistically. Sorry, blur out the background behind your subject quite realistically with a click of a button. So if we have a look here, let's max this out like crazy. And as you can see, a little before and after, things are looking way more blurry. As I've always mentioned, I would never recommend to just max out the slider. So if we dial this back just a little bit, maybe even around that 20 mark looks pretty good to me, a little before and after. And you can play around this once again until your heart's content. You can even change your, the bokeh, this is what they call it. That's even labeled right there. The outer focused shapes behind your subject. This works best when you are working with lights specifically. If you have a look in my shot right here, I'll cut to a wide shot. You can see all of these little lights right here. That is what we call bokeh. Now, if this was a photo, I could change the shapes of this inside of Lightroom, which is quite crazy. You know, you can change it to a hexagon, you can change it to this, and this is super, super cool that you can do this inside of Lightroom. So go ahead and play around with the lens blur tool when it suits. If we have a look at this image here, there is absolutely no point in putting lens blur on this photo. Maybe unless we had someone sitting in this chair right here and we wanted the background to be even blurrier than it was, then absolutely go for it. But there's no clear sort of subject in this image whatsoever. And same thing with this shot here. If I hit apply here, I'd be very interested to see what Lightroom sees as blurry or like needs to be blurred or not blurred. And we can hit visualize depth here. And you can see here what should be in focus is what we've got in this bar right here. So it's really only blurring these little dark purple parts up there. So if we turn this off once again and then hit blur amount like crazy, okay, yeah, you can really see up here starts to get blurred, but now things just look a little bit weird. It shouldn't be that blurry because everything else sort of looks quite sharp. So what I'm gonna do is definitely turn that off. Once again, try and use this only when you have a very clear subject in your hand or you're taking a portrait of someone or whatever the case. Anyway, with a lens blur out of the way, let's move into effects. I'm gonna open up this image here when we're talking about effects, and that is because we can either add vignette here or we can add grain here. I'm gonna show you in just a moment how you can add vignette and really customize your vignette in the masking tab. So I'll just give you a quick run through here. You can either decrease or increase. Obviously increase doesn't look all that nice, but this really just helps your viewer sort of focus in on the subject that you have shot. So it would work really, really well right here. If we decrease it here, you can see the behind the phone sort of gets a little bit darker because it's darkening the corners of the image. And that's what a vignette does. And you can go ahead in here and, you know, select the midpoint, the roundness, how much you want it to be feathered, so on and so forth. And then we can also add grain into our shot. Now this is something I've been doing quite a lot. And if you download the Filmic Feels Lightroom preset pack that you can find linked down below, you'll see that I add a load of grain to those images, of course, because I'm trying to make them look like they were shot on film. Grain is a little bit different to noise, especially digital noise. Digital noise can come along with a whole load of color and weird color distortion. So adding grain isn't adding noise back into your photo specifically, but if we just max this out, as you can see, things get a little bit rougher, things get quite a bit grittier, and you can change all of the settings here. So, you know, size, we can max out, roughness, we can max out, and now the image is more or less destroyed. So we're gonna reset those, and we're gonna also reset this slider here. I like adding grain to my shot. It just gives it a little bit more of a raw feeling. So if we just increase this slider ever so slightly, you can see now that if we turn this off and back on, it just muddies up those shadows a little bit. And for some reason right now, I love the look of that. Now moving into the last panel inside of our develop tab, we have got our calibration sliders. Now this is all to do with your camera's color science. If you go ahead and shoot the exact same photo on a Canon and a Sony, the colors will look slightly different. And that's because what we are using is the manufacturer's color science. What Canon deems to be blue might be a little bit different to what Sony deems as blue. But what you can do here is you can really go ahead and dial in the exact colors that you want to be using in your shot. Now, I'm going to walk you through exactly how I use this tool. It's a little bit rough, if you will, but I find that it gives you the best sort of result. So let's do exactly that. Let's first start off with the shadows. What I do is just max it out to the left, max it out to the right, and see what way do I want to push it. I'm going to reset that because I'm quite happy with the color of the shadows in this image. And then let's do the same thing for the red primary. All the way to the left, all the way to the right. I much prefer how things are looking when I'm moving the slider to the left. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the saturation. Definitely prefer over to the right. Now moving on to the green, move the greens over to the right a little bit. Definitely prefer maybe just a slightly desaturated look, and then the same thing with the blues here. The blues control quite a lot, especially of the orange on these trams. So I want to make just a very small move here, and then we should be able to see what things look like with that as well. And just like that, we've taken our photo from this to this, pretty quickly just with the camera calibration sliders. Go easy on these sliders, play around with them on every single shot, and you kind of get to develop and dial in your, once again, for like the 7th time, your personal editing style, because you really get to play around with your camera's color science. That can help out quite a lot. All right, now with all of that out of the way, we have wrapped up the Develop tab apart from 3 tools, okay? And those 3 tools are as follow. We have got the Remove tool, and the Remove tool is exactly what you think it is. The Remove tool has got a load of updates over the past year. We can now use generative AI in the little eraser one. We've got the healing little, what would you even call that? Little plaster thing there. And then we've also got the clone stamp tool. I find myself doing pretty much 90% of the removes in my images over in Photoshop, but since this is a Lightroom video, we are going to make sure we have it use generative AI selected, and then we are going to increase our brush size quite a lot, and we're going to remove this little weird white thing right there. We're going to make sure that it is completely covered, hit remove, and let generative AI do its thing. Once again, I find that the remove tools inside of Photoshop are far better. However, this has absolutely nailed it. So before and after, you can see that little weird white thing is now gone. And that was simply just by using the little eraser tool here. Make sure generative AI is selected and you'll be good to go. Now, red eye correction. I don't have any people in any of these shots, but all you've got to do more or less is find some red eyes, kind of click and drag a little bit, or just click depending on how big the subject size is, and it should do a pretty good job at removing those eyes. I never really shoot with flashes, so I don't really have this issue, but if you do, it's a pretty good way to remove them. And now we get to move on to arguably the best part of a Lightroom Classic. I know we've really left it to the last minute. We're talking about the masking tab. Now you can do so much inside of the masking tab. It is crazy. And I'm gonna walk you through pretty much a complete crash course inside of the masking tab, because I wanna make sure you have the best experience when you're editing inside of Lightroom. So the first mask that I wanna walk you through is the subject mask. All you've gotta do, maybe this will be a bit of a better photo to use, is hit subject, and then Lightroom is gonna more or less take the entire hard work of masking out, and it works about like 85, 90% of the time, and it's gonna find the subject in your image, mask it out, and then you can come down here and you can make local adjustments to that exact area. Now, it doesn't nail it every single time, but when it does, it can save you a lot of work and kind of tedious work. So for example, you can see here that it's also selected the headlight of this car. If we wanted to remove part of that headlight, or if we wanted to remove the headlight at all we'd have to do is come over to the little dots here. Whoop, little dots. Oh dear. Okay, let's close that, reopen it up, click here, the little dots right there, intersect the mask with brush, and then we would want to make sure invert is ticked off, and then we would come in here, and okay, this is quite hard to do with this yellow overlay. I can't see it super accurately, but just like that, we could then remove it, and now we're not affecting that headlight right there. Let's now move on to the sky mask. This one is pretty straightforward. All you've got to do is hit select sky, and this one pretty much works every single time. Lightroom will now mask out where the sky is, and once again, you can make all the local adjustments to your image just like that. If we now remove that mask, we can also then hit select background. Well, let's go back onto this photo here where we've got a clear subject. We've then got Lightroom masking out our background here. Once again, I'm not going to do it this time, but you'd be able to select these 3 dots, intersect mask with brush, and then remove my fingers here. A little bit of stuff coming over on the phone as well. Really clean that up. And then that is pretty much the best part of the AI auto masks. Now, I know I've rushed through those quite quickly because they are as simple as click, use, adjust, and you're good to go. But there are these 3 masks right here that I want to walk you through. The first one is the radial gradient. Now, if we click and drag, you can see we get a circle coming up on our shot right here. Now, chances are your color overlay looks a little bit different. Chances are it is red. I've changed mine to green as I find that that is the color that I have least in my images and that I can see kind of as easy as possible. Now, if you do want to remove this color overlay so you can see the exact changes that you're making to your shot, all you've got to do is hit O, and O will remove the color overlay. So that is just a little bit of a hack there. Took me a little while to figure that out, but that is an absolute game changer. So what can you do with the radial mask? Well, you could put it up here in the corner, for example, and increase the exposure. And then it looks like we've got a little bit of light coming into our shot, but let's not do that. The thing I love doing the most with this is creating a custom shaped vignette hitting invert, and then dropping the exposure. Now, this really helps your subject stand out from your image quite a lot, which is something that I love doing. And why I don't use the vignette tool is because I can customize the exact shape so much easier than I can if I am, let's zoom out here, than I can if I'm using the vignette tool. Now, things are a little bit dramatic here, so let's increase the exposure just a touch. And just like that, before and after, things are looking way nicer purely just from that one mask. And you can also come in here and turn that off and back on just by using this little eye. Now, let's move into our brush mask here. This is exactly what you think it would be as well. It's where you can just click and kind of draw around on certain parts of your images and then just adjust those parts. You do want to keep a few things in mind though. I would suggest pretty much always leaving auto mask turned on when you want to stay inside the lines. Lightroom does a really good job, as you can see there. Maybe it messed up a little bit because the colors are getting a little bit too uncontrasty. But when you've got some really nice contrasting lines, Lightroom does a pretty good job at staying in the lines when auto mask is turned on. You can also control the feather of your mask, so of your brush, I should say. So if you just wanted it to be really harsh, like harsh lines like that, by all means, go for it. I personally find myself leaving feather in between 80 and 100, and then so on and so forth. You can control the flow and the density of your mask here as well. For me, once again, I always leave these at 100, but let's say you made a little bit of a mistake and now you need to adjust where you put your mask. Well, instead of deleting the whole mask, you can just come in here to erase, zoom in once again, and all I'm doing there is clicking on our navigator, and then I can just come in here and brush some stuff off just like that. And that's removing that mask. And of course, we can open up this and then we can make all of the changes that you can, nearly all of the changes you can inside of the basic tab, apart from a few things. And you can really start to dial in the looks of your images. But let's remove these masks from our shot. And then the last mask I want to walk you through is a linear gradient. Now, this is similar to the radial gradient, except you're using it as a sort of like a big line, if you will. Now, you can do this at any angle. You can make it as harsh as you want, for example, like that, or you can make it as feathered as you want. And this is also very, very good for making either light come into your shot, just like the radial gradient, or just darkening certain parts of your images to have even more control over the vignette or exactly where your viewer's eyes are going. So I find that you can do a lot inside the linear gradient. And of course, you can edit it just like any other mask. So you can come in here, intersect it with a brush, for example, and then we could come in here, make sure invert is turned off, and then brush away part of that mask. Now, the last thing I want to walk you through before we get into the export side of things is really fine detail selection when it comes to mask, and that is through color ranges and luminance ranges. So if we open up our three dots right here, and you can see we've got our our linear gradient right here is the green. We can intersect it with a luminance range. Now, what this will allow us to do is select inside of the mask what areas we want to select based on how bright or how dark they are. So for example, let's say I wanted to grab this and just move this. You can start to see part of the image starts to become not green again. Part of the mask starts to become not green again. And that's because I'm masking out the darker parts of the mask. I'm removing them from the shot. And you can do the same thing with the bright areas as well. So as you can see, as I'm removing this, all of the bright areas of the mask start to get removed. Once again, very, very powerful. And you can do arguably the exact same thing. If we delete that luminance range, you can do the exact same thing with colors as well. So when you open up a color range, you're automatically given this dropper right here. And let's say, click on the little orange part right there. Boom, it removes everything that isn't orange. Or if you wanted to do it the other way around, you could invert it and now it removes everything that is orange. These two parts of masking are huge. I find that the masking workflow on my images are massive. If you want to go ahead and check out any of my Lightroom workflows where I walk you through exactly how I edit photos, you can do so. I have a full playlist over on my channel, so I'd go ahead and recommend to do that. But that pretty much wraps up everything you need to know about how to edit your photos inside of Lightroom, aside from exporting. To export your image, all you want to do on Mac is hit Command-Shift-E. On Windows, it would be Control-Shift-E, and then you're brought up to this panel right here. Now I'm gonna walk you through my Instagram export settings, and I'm only gonna walk you through my Instagram export settings. If you want to know my full export settings, my full size, my watermarks, how I do that, you can go ahead and check out my Lightroom course, which is just about to be released. I didn't want to mention it on this video, but I do want to keep some things only specific in that course. Either way, let's walk through our Instagram export settings. We are going to be exporting it to my desktop in a subfolder called Untitled Export. You can put this anywhere you want. All you've got to do is choose the location. File naming, I rename things to the file name. I don't actually know if I click off this, we should just be exporting the file name, but either way, Lightroom gives you this option, so I don't want anything to be different. I want to make sure the file names stay as I imported them, as it makes it really easy to search. Let's move past video, as this isn't a video. For Instagram, we want to make sure our image format is set to JPEG, quality set to 85. We don't want to limit the file size, and our color space is sRGB, just like that. And the reason why we're exporting at 85% quality is because we are looking to avoid that Instagram compression. Moving on, I'm going to skip over content credentials, as personally, I don't use this all that much. But if I wanted to, it should automatically be connected to your Adobe account, but you can attach your content credentials. So if anyone were to look at this image, they can see all of the edits that have been made on the image, and if any AI was used, which is quite handy. And then this is the meat and potatoes of things. Resize your image to the long edge. Make sure the long edge is set to 2700 pixels, and your resolution is set to 72 pixels per inch, not pixels per centimeter. And then we can go ahead, hit export, and you are done. Wow, what a video. This has been probably the longest video I've ever made on this channel. So if you've learned a thing or two, let me know what it was down in the comments down below. If you want to go ahead and skip a load of the hardness of when it comes to editing your photos inside of Lightroom Classic, go ahead and check out my Lightroom presets linked down below. And guys, I will catch you in the next one. Peace.